College promises a lot: friends, purpose, learning, happiness, a suspicious relationship with iced coffee. But no one tells you how to actually get these things or why getting these things can still leave you feeling empty. So most students are left to navigate the college maze with a broken compass and no understanding of where to go. It turns out, though, human development follows patterns, predictable ones. And that's why I've spent the last 6 years trying to develop a model of ego development for college freshmen, a map for how you can grow throughout your time in college. I developed this with three of the leading theories of ego development, including integral theory, Greuter's 9 stages of ego development, and spiral dynamics. Now, I know I just threw three massive theories of ego development here. Don't worry, you don't actually have to go through any of them because I'm going to be the one breaking down all those theories into this one mega theory for college ego development. So I did the suffering so you don't have to. Now, this is the 5 stage map that I wish I had when I came to Cornell University 5 years ago. And by locating yourself through these 5 stages on the map, you can scaffold your growth way faster than freshmen that just have to navigate without anything. That, or it might make you cry a little in the shower. I know it did for me the first time that I saw where I was on the stages. The question is, how should you use this conscious college journey? The map is not something you win. It's something that you orient with. The goal of this is not to become some judgmental framework that you use in order to get mad at yourself, get mad at others in college. The goal is to use it to orient non-judgmentally and with care towards where you are and how you can continue growing throughout college. So what I would do with this map is I would start by locating where you are on the map currently, not the one you admire, not the one you aspire to, where you currently are on the map. And then I would look backward instead of forward. Most struggles in college don't come from being behind. They actually come from unintegrated shadows from previous stages on the map. So notice what patterns still repeat themselves from earlier stages. Notice where there is points that you can grow by transcending and integrating those shadows. And then through practice, you can start to work your way up towards the next stage. Also, send this to a friend and talk about it, not to judgmentally map each other, but to build a mutual understanding and compassion for where you both are. A few principles that I want you to keep in mind as I go through this map. Firstly, this journey is dimensional, not categorical. It is very rare that you find someone who is 100% one stage. That doesn't happen. Most of the time, you're 50% grounded in one stage, 25% in one below you, and 25% in one above. Humans are incredibly complex, and it's impossible to fully box them into one place. Another insight is that every one of these stages is necessary for development. You cannot skip any of these stages. You have to go through them in order to reach the next. Just like, unfortunately, skipping leg day at the gym will cause some strife, skipping stages in ego development will also cause shadows. And then the last thing is that every stage includes light aspects as well as shadow aspects. Light aspects are the healthy formation of that stage, whereas shadow aspects come through attachment to a previous stage, either through addiction, you're so close to it, or allergy, you're super avoidant of it. So Every stage can be both good and bad, depending upon the context. Now, with that being said, are you ready? This is going to completely, radically transform the way that you see yourself, others, and the world. And I wish that I had had this when I was in freshman year. It would have been incredibly helpful. So let's start with the first tier of stages. There are 3 tiers in the 5-stage model. Tier 1 is what's known as self-authoring. So these are all stages of ego development, which there are 3 in Tier 1, that are about building a sense of self, an ego. You don't yet have a solid sense of self. You're still looking to find what your values are, your personality, your skills, your relationships, and your purpose. Think of it like the first few hours of an RPG when you're putting a whole bunch of points in skills, but you don't really know what they do yet. And this is in contrast to Tier 2 and Tier 3 structures or stages, which focus on deconstructing the self and then transcending it. So, with that being said, let's start with stage 1, the cosmic follower. And the color associated with this stage is amber, which also correlates with integral theory's colors. So in the future, whenever I refer to any stage, I'll either say the name, the cosmic follower, or I'll say the color, amber. Most of you are likely not this stage, but the reason that I still brought it in is because I think it's an incredibly important stage to talk about, since it's right below where most college students are to some degree. So it's very useful to know this stage because the shadows from it can still come up and affect the stage that most college freshmen are in. So what is the cosmic follower, or amber? The cosmic follower is learning how to belong. Their self is capable of first and second person thinking, but they struggle with third. They struggle with putting themselves outside of an interaction and looking at it from more of an objective viewpoint. They're what's associated with a pre-modern worldview. They're conformist, identifying with groups, institutions, ideologies, roles, and this can make them deeply structured, loyal, and reliable on one end, but also rigid, lonely, and self-righteous on the other. They move through college by aligning with what feels safe, approved, and validated, and often stick closer to their own in-group and avoid out-group interactions. This stage, amber, is where most of society across the world has been in for the last few thousand years. And you can still spot it in many places in the world today, rife in third world countries and regions like India and China, Africa, parts of South America, and the Middle East. Of course, with variations depending upon the context. And again, this is not meant as a judgment of those areas. This is not some, the ego map is not some racist ideology. It is a mapping of development, not because of some inherently wrong thing with the place that is in a certain stage, but rather as a caring understanding of where they're at because of the context that they're brought up in. Someone in the Middle East or in a very difficult geographic area is not going to have the same development as a very temperate forest landscape like the United States. So this stage was me during most of elementary and early middle school. And the reason is I used to be super into fiction writing and reading and whatnot. And then I felt very lonely in my hometown because I lived at the top of a hill and I couldn't easily integrate with those in the town itself, in the valley. And I was also weird with how much I read and how into fiction I was. So during elementary and middle school, I started to ebb away from those books and just conform more to what other people were doing, like using social media, playing video games, talking about absolutely nothing at the lunch table. And this helped me feel more connection on the one hand, but it also felt inauthentic to who I was. Some potential examples you might recognize Amber in are particularly rigid friend groups in college, frats and sororities, athletic teams, and if you've ever described your friends as the boys or the girls, then you're very in danger of being an Amber. This self-other boundary of this stage, they're differentiated between first and second person, so that lets them move between their perspective and another. They can genuinely ask, how does this other person feel? How do they think? But it's difficult for them to take a third person perspective. So an example of it's difficult for potentially an Amber athletic team member to take a third person perspective and see how a nerd would see their interactions with their fellow athletic team members. How would the nerd think, oh, this doesn't seem very fun or tame in terms of interaction. This locker room talk is disturbing. It's hard for them to do that because of being an Amber. Another example would be seeing a genuine value in the Democratic perspective or the Republican perspective if you're the opposite political party, and vice versa. Some light sides of Amber is they can be very loyal, reliable, willing to sacrifice for the group. They can follow structure, routines, and expectations quite well. And they also have this beautiful shared values and traditions and collective identity because of their more communal nature. However, the shadow of some of these can be they overly judge out group and overly defend in group. Even if the in group is wrong or being rude, simply because they are the in group, Amber will protect them. They can, because of this, lose self inside of their groups, in their ideology, in their roles, and find it difficult to make their own sense of identity separate from the group. They can be rigid, lonely, and self-righteous because of this. We know the way. We have the best group, the right group, the only group. Some questions that they're asking inside of college are, how can I deepen my connection with my in-group? What is everyone else doing? And why do I feel so inauthentic? In terms of needs, like what needs they have in life and how that is developing, they're quite focused on, in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, on safety and connection, particularly on the bottom of the pyramid. They want to feel safe and secure financially, in relationships. And by connection, it's less about an authentic, loving relationship with someone else, but more a sense of belonging in a group. That comes later in stages after. The problem is their role-based rigidity and communal nature makes it quite hard to form more of that authentic connection because the identity of the other person is so wrapped up in the group. It's harder for that separate sense of self to be appreciated. They can repress higher growth needs in order to conform. A characteristic phrase of Amber is, you had a dream once and then you didn't. And they also feel a responsibility to fulfill needs that's often put on others. It's not fully their responsibility yet to fulfill their needs. They expect their group to help them with that. more than expect. They believe that they should. In terms of physical development, they have an almost non-existent connection to the body. They treat it the way that most people treat the terms and services agreement at the end of any sign-up process. They use distraction routines and substances to avoid bodily signals. Like, if I stay busy enough, then I won't have to feel that weird chest thing. They're also disconnected from their rest, their intuition, and somatic feedback. And the reason is that if they felt more into this somatic feedback and this emotion, they might notice how difficult the relationships that they're in are making it to feel that authentic connection. In terms of emotional development, they see emotions as sort of like a jungle that can hold truths, but also cloud the truth a lot. On the opposite end, they might way overinvest in emotions too much. And this is actually an interesting thing about a lot of the stages, which is a lot of them, especially before tier 2, you can overreact or underreact in aspects of the stage. So for example, with Amber, a big characteristic is that communal group-based valuing of the in-group. This can be healthily integrated into just like a good valuing of group and belonging, or it can be unhealthily integrated in either direction. So you can be way over investing, which is the shadow side of addiction, where you're way too caring of groups and valuing your in-group. Or it can be more of an allergy, which is where you do value the group, but you run away from it for one reason or another. But because you're still Amber, this causes a lot of resistance emotionally. And this happens in all the stages. We'll see as we get into stage 2, stage 3. It can be reacted to either through an addiction or an allergy. And of course, as I said earlier, none of these lines have to be all embodied in order to be in this stage. Almost nobody in Amber is going to be all of these things that I'm saying. They're going to be in one line of emotional development that's a stage up, maybe one line down in cognitive development. It's a mixed bag. And this is just the characteristics, the comical characteristics of the stage. Another emotional aspect of stage Amber is they feelings that they have are tied to external events, which sheds responsibility for them feeling those things and having interpreted those feelings in the way they did. A funny example of this is when I was a kid. I remember there was this one day where my mom took away my Minecraft privileges. Oh no. And I was livid. I was so mad. I think she did it because I played way too much the last few weeks. But in the moment, instead of asking why I was so angry, I just became the anger, right? This external event, my mom taking away Minecraft, was the reason for me being angry, and therefore deserved me to show the anger, allowed me to show the anger. And so what I did is I ran away for the incredibly long period of an hour into our forest in the back. And I just kind of like walked around and hacked away dead trees with an axe. And then after an hour, I was like, well, this kind of sucks. So I came back. She made me a meal, and I think I had the wisdom to say sorry, but I can't remember exactly. So this is characteristic of Amber emotions, is the way you feel is representative of the way things are, not one interpretation among many for that external landscape. Motivationally, Amber tends to value 3 core drives in specific. And when I say core drives, I'm referring to the Octalysis framework, which is a framework for understanding motivation through 8 different core drives. I have videos on it above if you want. You don't have to have seen it in order to understand the motivations here, though. So those 3 core drives that they really value, one is core drive 5, which is social influence and relatedness, our motivation to collaborate, to compete, to connect with others. The primary driver for this is fitting in, approval, and loyalty. Then we have core drive 1, which is epic, meaning, and calling. And this is the drive to do something greater than ourselves, invest in something bigger than ourselves. So for Amber, that is investing in this group and the shared meaning of being a part of this club, this team, this nation, this religion, this ideology or cause. Finally, we have core drive 8, which is loss and avoidance. This is the motivation to avoid painful things which could happen to us. And here, that's shown through a fear of exclusion, of shame, or of being wrong. So an example, I remember a few weeks ago, I was visiting my uncle's family, and my cousins did not want to take a picture in front of some of the terraces in the market that we were at, Vermont, because they felt that others would judge them for like smiling at a photo. And I was very compassionate in the moment. I thought it was really funny, to be honest. They did let me tease them a little, but this is characteristic loss, a motivation of loss and avoidance, a fear of what are these people gonna do if they see me smiling with my white teeth? And they have lovely teeth, so it was quite funny to me that they didn't want to take that photo. Next in Amber development is cognitive, which is they can analyze and draw rule-based connections between things, but they struggle to evaluate using a third-person perspective outside of the box of their in-group. So, for example, they can draw connections between different mathematical concepts, but they would struggle immensely to come up with or question the premises behind how they got to that mathematical answer. Like, why are we using this math equation or the specific process for doing the math? Or they would also struggle to come up with their own method of solving a problem outside of anything that someone else has told them to do. They also see truth as what aligns with their in-group and authority figures. So, for example, if the Quran or the Veda or the Pope says it, it's true. And if science says it, then it's true. So it's not just religion that could be amber. You can also have an amber scientist if they're way comically overvaluing of science and they aren't willing to see other perspectives like spirituality, religion, more woo-woo forms of science. Another example is of me not questioning what's being taught in my global history class. I wasn't questioning the very fact in 10th grade that Christopher Columbus's voyage was taught positively, or World War II was taught negatively. And I'm not saying that World War II is a positive thing. I'm just saying the very fact that I didn't question it at all is very amber thinking. They're quite black and white literal thinkers. Hell is physically real, and it's called group projects. People in that major always work too hard. This is how you should study. It's very black and white and literal, not metaphorical, not multi-perspectival. In terms of social development, there's a great emphasis on outward appearance, who you hang out with, and what you do with them. There's bonding through shared enemies, beliefs, or rituals. Like, we hate that dining hall, and yet still eat there daily. Relationships are role-based, they're conflict-averse, and they're conforming. This is my gym friend. This is my study friend. This is my existential dread friend. All separate. In terms of moral development, they're ethnocentric, meaning they value their club, their nation, and their race a lot. Not world-centric, or even better, cosmocentric yet. They value authority, loyalty, and purity more than care, freedom, and liberty. This is some great research done by Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Righteous Mind, where he did a lot of these moral values studying across the world. And this is exactly what he found, which is more conservative, amber-oriented regions tend to value loyalty, authority, and purity more than more liberally oriented regions. Their morality is more rule-based and less flexible. This is bad, that is good. In terms of aesthetic development, they see aesthetics often as identity signals rather necessarily than expression. So for example, you see a lot of this in Christian art of the European medieval period. A lot of it was meant to showcase devotion towards Christianity and Jesus. There was, to some degree, a valuing of the expression, the art of the art itself, but a lot of it, more so than later stages, is just to show your identity, your affiliation with this group. And what's interesting is that you can still be amber even if you have rebellion aesthetics. It seems like the opposite of amber. Oh, you're rebelling against the norm. But if you rebel in a way where you're still conformist with your rebelling group, you're still amber. So, for example, being goth with all your other goth friends without questioning why you're goth or what values of goth culture you agree with or don't agree with. Then we have, lastly, spiritual development. Spiritually, amber collapses spirituality into religion, ideology, or nationalism. It's less so about spirituality universally and more about spirituality in my group. Faith is used for certainty often and belonging rather than inquiry. In fact, many amber religions or ideologies believe doubt is a sin. And the reason is that if it was not seen as a sin, then you would ascend to the next stage because you wouldn't be able to conform anymore. There is a spiritual bypassing of doubt, of complexity, of inner work. What I mean by spiritual bypassing is a skipping over of necessary development to get to further stages by simply adhering to spirituality for the name, but not the spirit. So meditating every single day or praying to God, but not really feeling it, not really changing your life and the way you relate to it because of those practices. Now, some nuances that I want to emphasize before we go on to the next stage. That was amber. Hope that you see how useful this map is now. See how much more color you might see in your college relationships now. What amber aspects do you have? What amber aspects do your friends have? Do your professors have? We all have some because the stages build on each other. They transcend and they include. They don't go away. Some nuances that I want to give you. Why is ascending a stage so hard? It's because in order to ascend a stage, you have to die. I don't mean physically, I mean psychologically. Yourself, your concept of who you are needs to change. You have to shed the old self like a butterfly leaving the cocoon. And the ego resists this because it has to leave to change in order to do that. So have a little more compassion for yourself not being at the furthest stage because of this. It's also hard because of this ropes metaphor, which I like, which is you're grounded in the stage that you are, and there's ropes tying you to the one below, as well as aspirational ones reaching that you can reach for on the one above. These ropes tying you below are quite loose when life is good, when you're not under stress, but they can tighten when you are under stress. And this is the cleanest explanation for why your old patterns sneak back under pressure. It's the shadow. Doesn't mean they can't sneak back when you're also feeling good. There is a shadow side to too much positivity as well. But it's most likely that you'll experience the shadows from below when you're under stress. And the last nuance I want to give is that states are not the same as structures. This is a key insight that Ken Wilber gives in integral theory. And essentially what it means is that structure stages the things that we're talking about now, your ability to take different perspectives, your degree of development across all of these lines, motivational, emotional, moral. Those are quite separate from your state development, which is your degree of depth of consciousness. How deep are you into the gross state, the subtle state, the causal state, the witnessing state? You don't have to know what these are. All you need to know is that it is entirely different to experience a state than to be grounded in a state. So, for example, a blue fundamentalist might have an ego death trip on mushrooms, which is a state of enlightenment. But once they come back and they're no longer in that state, because they're grounded in a structure stage that is amber, they come back and they defend why milk and meat can't mix. Because apparently the universe is one, but these specific dishes have to be separate. So the point is, states and structures are quite independent in development, and structures determine how you interpret states. This is why you can have someone who's quite enlightened, quite wise sounding, and yet might be in quite a low structure stage, like amber or the next one that we'll go into. And therefore, they interpret reality in quite a racist or xenophobic or whatever other manner. So our goal with the ego map is to ascend in structure stages. We'll have a separate video on states, but the last stage in the map of ego development actually merges the two, the highest structure stage and the highest state stage. So you'll get a glimpse of that there. So that was amber, stage 1. Now we're going to move to the stage that I hedge my bets most college freshmen are grounded in to some degree. There's also a lot at stage 3, but from my experience, this is the stage where I've seen most freshmen, and it's also the stage that most of these ego development theories that I integrated together would agree a lot of the world is at. So, stage 2, the cosmic climber, color orange. So, amber, cosmic follower, cosmic climber, orange. The cosmic climber has stepped outside of the collective orbit, and they've begun authoring their own path. Their self is identified with independence, with competence, and the beginnings of self-improvement, using college as a proving ground for identity, skill, and external metrics of success. They're capable of more complex third-person perspective taking and formalized abstract thinking. But they still struggle to prioritize between these options. So they can take a third-person perspective and to some degree try and give more of an objective viewpoint, but it's still hard for them to really take that third person. This corresponds with the modern worldview, where much of society is at. Their new self is scared of returning to being a cosmic follower, and so they often take feedback personally. And there's little appreciation for systemic meta thinking, the connecting of mind and heart, and the multiplicity of perspectives. This stage is popular in many wealthier regions of the world, like the United States, Australia, and some parts of Europe. Now, for me, I came into this stage during late middle school and early high school. I remember I was quite tired of being more of this amber communitory individual. And so in late middle school, I decided, no, it's time to make something of myself. So I turned to our God, YouTube, and I found this rabbit hole of getting into an Ivy League and getting really good grades. And I thought, well, if there's one way to measure myself and keep score, it's grades. Because at this stage, it's still hard to measure yourself internally. So I started getting good grades, tracking it like a homing missile. And I was very into self-improvement. My goodness, I read countless books like The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, How to Win Friends and Influence People, Atomic Habits, the whole shebang. So that was me during late middle school and high school. Some other examples which are orange, you might find them in pre-professional tracks like pre-med, pre-law, finance, consulting, tech pipelines. Again, there's exceptions, but these are more well-regarded areas. And so that's why you'll find orange a lot there. Startup and hustle cultures like running clubs, side projects, personal brands. Honors programs and competitive majors, which is students differentiating themselves through rigor and achievement. The self-other boundary in this stage, they're capable of taking a third-person perspective to first and second person, which Amber was not, but they mostly still frame advice and thinking from their own perspective without realizing it. So, for example, an atheist arguing with a Buddhist about why Buddhism isn't real from a rationalist viewpoint, but they're not stepping out and questioning their own rationalist viewpoint. This is what Leo Gura in actualize.org calls fake skepticism, which is on the outside, you look like a skeptic. You're this rational, multi-perspectival thinker from a third person, and yet you're not questioning your own skepticism, your own way that you're being skeptical. Being rational in your skepticism is just one manner of being skeptical among many. From the light side, cosmic climber, orange, can have this drive towards competence, towards success, and independence. They're willing to question norms, traditions, and inherited beliefs of amber. And in relationships, they value authenticity, vibing, and personal agency much more. However, on the shadow side, this can make them overly independent, a lonely lone wolf. They can overvalue external metrics of success. So, for example, me valuing grades more in middle school and high school, I remember I valued it so much that I read the AP Global book 6 times over to study for the exam, which is a terrible way to study. And I wasn't looking for other options because I just cared about the grade, not actually learning to learn better. Relationships can become more instrumental and more shallow because of this. And another insight is, just like with Amber, you can still be stage orange and not embody the light aspects of like being hardworking and achievement oriented. You might have a shadow version of stage orange, which is where You do value achievement and hard work and making something of yourself, but you're just not doing it. Like you're procrastinating a lot. Others might call you lazy. And so this makes you feel terrible because you're not living up to these ideals, but you're still orange because you're valuing the things that orange does. And the negative feelings are coming from not embodying those values. Some questions that orange is asking are my friends really the right people I should be spending my time with? So a characteristic thing that happens in orange is transformational conflict, which is where your current version of self is now conflicting with your past because the values that you have now no longer embody or flow with the values that you had before. And so you might lose friends, you might lose hobbies, you might lose skills. And this happened a lot to me during high school when I got into self-improvement. I found it harder to connect with my old video gamer friends. This is not something wrong with you. This is a natural part of growing up the stages. And what you need to figure out is how you want to change your old life to match with your new. Hopefully in a loving way, but we all make mistakes as we go up the stages in terms of changing. I know I have. And one last question that they're asking is, why do I feel exhausted, anxious, or empty despite doing everything seemingly right? In terms of needs development, they are primarily focused on self-esteem instead of safety and connection. It's really about, how do I feel that sense of self-esteem, that I have purpose, that I'm competent in something, that I accept myself. But they still put some responsibility on needs fulfillment on others. So this is kind of the stage where you start realizing nobody's going to save you, but at the same time, you kind of wish someone did. That would feel so good. So physically, their sleep, their nutrition, and their movement can be sacrificed for goals. You might hear them say, if you haven't pulled an all-weeker, then you aren't really trying. But on the flip side, the beginning of self-improvement in health might make their health actually prioritized. So for me, that was kind of good, but it also had a negative shadow, which is where I was super into exercise and eating well, but I was so toxic about it in high school that when I came to college, I had this timetable so strict for when I had my meals that if a friend wanted to get lunch even 30 minutes outside of it, I would just say no. Yeah, I was very rigid. Emotionally, the stage orange can still mistake emotions as externally rooted rather than internally. And they often use negative emotions as fuel, like anxiety, resentment, restlessness, sadness, anger. These are ways to drive you to do more. They can value left brain thinking more than right brain, which basically just means they can value thinking more than feeling, which doesn't mean they don't feel. It just means that those emotions come in other ways. Motivationally, they value black hat left brain more than white hat right brain. What that means in octalysis is simply that they're more extrinsically motivated than intrinsically motivated. And they can also, they value core drive 2, development and accomplishment, a lot. Our drive to grow, to achieve mastery, to build our competence. This can show up in practically oriented self-improvement. They're focused on doing the task right rather than the right task. External accomplishment is often prized over internal. Okay, you got a great grade, but did you follow your values while you were getting that grade? They value core drive 4, ownership and possession. And It's more grade focused to set themselves up for a good career. So they're more materialistically oriented in terms of ownership and accomplishment, and not as much caring about ecological or political impact. For example, in the last workplace that I was at, we're using AI a lot, and I wanted to use Claude because I respect the company a lot more than some of the other AI models. And it's also European. So politically, I stand with it more. However, my boss didn't didn't want me to ask for refunds on my subscription because I was using it primarily for work because it was so expensive. And they said, well, you shouldn't be using Claude. You should just use one of the really cheap Chinese models. And I knew it in the moment, even so, but I didn't realize how much conflict there was until after, of like me just being in a completely different stage of development from my boss. They were very orange, very, very orange. And I tried to have care and compassion and navigate it because I was learning so much in the job. But to disregard ecological and political impact so much by just casually saying, like, no, I'm not going to let you refund this $20 subscription, which is also very like profit motivated in itself because you should be using the Chinese model, was like, wow. Yeah. In terms of one other motivation, they have a lot of core drive 5 social influence and relatedness because they're stuck in the middle between reliance on others and validation of their own self. And they're quite competitive. They can be because they value accomplishment and achievement so much. And they mostly seek friends that they vibe with, have similar interests, and are driven rather than some of the deeper aspects of friendship. Cognitively, they're capable of formal evaluative reason, which is ARC 5 in my theory of learning, spiral knowing. You can check that up above. An example of this is they can come up with a new hypothesis on what humans are, why humans are confirmation biased, and they can evaluate a new hypothesis for that as well. They can also evaluate a strategy to win in League of Legends and try and iterate on that over time. This is something that was still difficult for Amber to do because if that iteration caused them to do something that's not been done before, then that makes it difficult. They see truth as scientific, as logical, as rational. So in the truth compass, they value scientific insight quite a lot. But this can lead them to devalue a lot of aspects of truth that are outside of that, like more holistic forms of truth, integrating spirituality and religion and science together. They can overvalue representational and practical knowing compared to more ephemeral participatory. So all that means is that they overvalue what looks like learning on the outside and is easier to hold, but undervalue the parts of learning that are more tacit, that you can't really put into words. So they wouldn't value something like visualization or meditation as a genuine means of learning in school, despite many, many studies showing some of their value now and them being done for thousands of years. In relationships, social development, they're more centered on shared goals, interests, or ambition, and whether you vibe with the person. Conflict can be handled through debate or withdrawal rather than dialogue. So an example was a hilarious fight between me and one of my friends, Hanyu, over why fat people are fat in high school. And I remember this could have been handled with dialogue, but I just wanted to win that debate so badly. And every single argument he put forth, I had the same response every single time, which he's like, well, I always said, why don't they just exercise more and eat less? And it was completely unfathomable to me, some of the arguments that Hanyu is giving of like the context that they're in literally makes them value exercise less or value uh, eating less because they're surrounded by relationships that don't prioritize that. And the reason you value exercise so much is because you've grown up in a family who valued it so much. So even though Orange can take a third person perspective, it was still very hard for me to understand that and to genuinely engage in this in a dialogue. They trend towards advice rather than holding others' emotions. They're often known for immediately offering solution when someone feels pain rather than just sitting with it. Morally, they're more nationalistic and world-centric, but this doesn't include evil people or animals. They question authority selectively, like professors, parents, institutions, but they still don't question all of them, right? And their worldview is very individualistic and merit-based. And I particularly felt this again in my last workplace, where they were heavily valuing of meritocracy to a comical degree, to the point where all of your allocations for projects were based off of how much value you gave, and not based off of what I believe they should be, which is to some degree of valuing of fulfilling the basic needs of the person if they're working full time, even as a contract worker. So in the full year and 2 months that I worked there, I earned only $23,000 and did 4 months of free work for no pay, because there is this culture at the company of, if you're not working on a project, or even if you are, you do free internal engagement to get put on another project to show that you care. This showed a comical degree of, first off, I put myself in this situation to some degree. I knew what I was doing, so it's some degree my responsibility. But also, this is a comical undervaluing of green-based regulations, which is the next stage that we'll get into. They see regulation as stifling. They see meritocracy as this king of how to assign value to people and give rewards. And it completely undervalues rights that you should have, and also equity in society, and systemic inequity, particularly how some people just aren't given the same opportunities. And maybe the amount of value you give shouldn't be the sole differentiator in how much reward you get, but just one aspect. Aesthetically, they find beauty in external representation of things and less so in the internal landscape. So they often really like the art, the craft of something, but they less so value the internal landscape that is trying to show. So they might really like realistic paintings of like just incredible detail, even if they don't really have much deeper meaning. Personal style is often used to signal individuality and competence rather than more deeper aspects. Beauty is appreciated, but often in more a sensory sense, and still secondary to function, engagement, and enjoyment. Spiritually, they are quite skeptical of traditional religion. Faith is seen as intellectually naive or emotionally compensatory. But a caveat is a stage orange individual might also be a religious person and just validating their religion with incredibly good rationalistic arguments. Spirituality is often reframed, if they do engage in it, as mindset, performance aid, or stress reduction. For example, using meditation to focus better, and less so for the deeper aspects of spirituality, like those we talk about on this channel. Truth can be seen as something to figure out, not yet something to become. Truth is more about the representational facts, the things you can say, rather than the things you can be and embody. So that's Orange, stage 2. Again, I hope you can see how you fit onto this map, and also how many of your friends or your college or even society as a whole might fit. At this point, everyone's going to have some orange aspects. This is definitely a more common stage. Some nuances that I want to give before the next stage is you can only see one or two stages above you. Everything higher is so threatening that the ego just puts up defenses. So as stage amber, you might be able to see some validity in stage orange and maybe green. But the stage after that, man, that's going to be hard. It's just too far away. It doesn't even make sense inside of your worldview. There's also a difference between content and structure. The content is the face value of something, whereas the structure is your relationship to it. So you should focus on the structure and not the content when it comes to your stage. For example, a Christian and an atheist can both be orange. And the reason is that their structure to the stage is orange, even though the Christian in content is religious, which could point them to being amber. The way that they relate to their religion is orange. They're more rational about it. They're more critical, and they don't just take everything literally that they read. So you want to be structured to the stage, not just in content. And then finally, focus on building an ecology of practices to build up the stages rather than just technique. Everyone needs a different journey to get to the next stage. I can't just tell you how to do it. That's why I'm giving you the map, but not how to follow the map. Awareness is the engine of ascent, and there's no single dogmatic method to get there, just a set of practices that balance and check each other. So the trick is for you to figure out which of those practices resonate with you and will help you ascend the stages rather than me telling you. That being said, let's get back to stage 3 with even more insight after a short break. Stage 3. This is where we get to some of the really good stuff. I still think a lot of college freshmen are at this stage, but it's quite hard to find college freshmen that are grounded completely in this stage. So this could be an aspirational goal for some of you compared to amber and orange. So stage 3 is the cosmic weaver, which color is green. The cosmic weaver is consciously authoring their individual life. They're no longer identified with traditional external metrics of success, but actually designing a coherent identity with their own purpose, their own internal values, and a long-term trajectory, understanding both their past and their future. They're beginning to adopt a fourth-person perspective rather than just first, second, and third, meaning that they can appreciate systemic influences, intersectionality, sociocultural and epistemological relativism, and the value of care, liberty, and fairness over just authority, purity, and loyalty. College becomes a platform for growth, for relationships, and for competence. And the start, instead of just self-improvement, the start of self-actualization. So you'll find green in many first world regions of the world, like the United States, as well as Europe, and also the international hubs of many countries where there's a lot of different perspectives coming together. This stage has come about mostly in the last 100 years or so, in things like the post-World Wars, in the civil rights movement of the United States, and also the United Nations. As for me, this came about mostly during my sophomore year of college. After my first girlfriend and I broke up, I met some really close friends of mine still to this day, Chris and John, and they both got me more into spirituality, which got me much more into green. Some potential examples of students in green is you might see students curating their course load, like choosing classes based on learning value, not just prestige or difficulty signaling. Mentors and peer advisors can often be in this stage because they help others clarify their goals without imposing their own, which requires a lot of green. The self-other boundary is beginning to adopt a fourth person perspective rather than just first, second, and third. So they can appreciate the relative perspectival nature of reality. This is what's known as a postmodern worldview. An example is they can see how someone growing up in rural China will have a different value system than someone growing up in the suburbs of New York City. And they can, while they still judge them to some degree, they can appreciate the differences between those and why they would have such a drastically different worldview because of that. The light side of green is they're beginning to understand systemic inequity, collective crisis, and intersectionality. An example for me is when I took my intergroup dialogue class in college, and I realized just how god dang much my white skin, my US nationality and Dutch nationality, my English speaking ability, and my male gender was helping me in life. It was humbling as well as sort of scary because I was like, oh shit. And that helps propel me further into green. Green has a strong sense of personal values and chosen direction, and also a genuine interest in growth, psychology, and self-understanding. However, the shadow side of green is that they can be too airy-fairy, too emotional, and interdependent in others. They can feel this chronic self-pressure and guilt for not living up to their full potential. And also, they can have a subtle superiority or judgment toward less developed others. So, for example, I was constantly astounded at the orange psychology of some of my fellow Cornell students. I was just amazed at how they could talk about how busy they were all the time, how they should take a particular class just because the grade was easy to get. And I remember there was also one day I was walking around Cornell where I saw someone wearing full white Lululemon. And I was just like, what are you doing? So I still had some subtle judgment towards these people, not taking into account as much as the next stage will, how every stage is necessary and the context that that person is in is making that stage work for them. Some of the questions that green is asking is, how can I find and build relationships of value, growth, and authenticity? Why do so many people act the way they do despite seeing how much it's hurting them? And this is a cool insight for green, is they're super interested in psychology, but they don't yet have the integral understanding of tier 2 ego to really understand why people act the way they do. That comes in tier 2. And one last question they're asking is, how can I understand myself better to grow? In terms of needs development, they're ebbing more into the growth needs of Maslow's hierarchy, needs of exploration, of love and purpose, rather than just deficiency needs. Self-actualization becomes more prominent alongside self-improvement. It's more spiritually based. There's less of an emphasis on improving oneself because you don't believe you have inherent self-worth, improving oneself externally, and more on the internal aspects of improvement and actualization. They do still put some responsibility of needs fulfillment on others, but it's mostly on the self. Physical development, there's more of an emphasis on the internal aspects of body rather than just external. For example, they might be able to tell their nervous system is dysregulated because they've read the same paragraph 3 times over in one of their readings. They're becoming more interested in mindfulness, in meditation, and in other reflective and contemplative practices, but it's still more of a practical oriented primarily practical. So like meditating to help you focus more. reflective and contemplative to help you build your emotional intelligence. They're starting to become open to intuition, visualization, imagination, and other more subtle forms of consciousness in terms of knowing reality. So you'll find green in the yoga classes on your campus. I can promise you that. In terms of emotional development, there's more of an internal rooting of emotions rather than external. They can appreciate how much their emotions are created by their own perception of something. Whereas with orange and amber, it was still more rooted in the external thing is causing the emotion. And this allows them to get into their optimal zone and navigate their autonomic nervous system. I actually have a video on that, how to build your stress regulation abilities in college, which you can check out up above. And they're also interested in the psychology of self and others. So you might find green accidentally psychoanalyzing you mid-conversation. They can't help it. It's sort of like me eating peanut butter whenever I see it. It's a little tick they can't avoid. And they often are known as the therapist of their friend group because of this. But this can actually lead to emotional exhaustion if green isn't careful, because they're so put front and center in helping their other friends' needs, which probably aren't grounded in green, since it's quite difficult to ground fully in it. And so, because the previous stages put more needs fulfillment on others, that makes them the numero uno choice for emotional navigation. And sometimes green can have a shadow where they actually really like the feeling of being needed by other people. And so they like being come to with emotional challenges. So be careful about that. Motivationally, they're beginning to value white hat, right brain core drives more than black hat, left brain. That simply means they're valuing more agentic intrinsic motivation rather than non-agentic extrinsic. So what that looks like is they value core drive 2, development and accomplishment, a lot. But instead of where orange was mostly valuing it for conventional accomplishment and extrinsic means, green values it for the mix of development and conventional accomplishment. They've mastered the art of getting good grades and learning. For example, sometimes this can be good, sometimes it can be bad. I remember in one of my classes at Cornell, I showed up to the first lecture and I could immediately tell that it was not going to be very thought-provoking, not very deep, not very difficult. But this was a required class, so I had to go to it. What I decided to do was I just didn't show up to any of the lectures. And then on the final day, when the exam was, I showed up in person to take the exam. And I still remember I walked up to the professor who was handing out the exams, and he looked at me and he said, "Are you sure you're in the right class?" And I was like, yep, this is the one. And he gave me the test with a really strange look on his eye. I felt a little bad about that one, but at the same time, it's because I just don't value just the grade anymore. I valued actually learning, and I wasn't going to spend more than 100 hours showing up to this class every single week just so that I could tick off the participation grade. Was I going to do it? So it's a trade-off. That's what happens when you're more motivationally green. Core Drive 3, empowerment of creativity and feedback, is also more valuable. They care about the authenticity and creating things rather than just sticking with what's already there. So you might hear green say things like, "I never knew drawing could be so fun," compared to engineering. They're much more creatively minded than orange and amber. And they also motivationally are very into social influence and relatedness, Core Drive 5. They want value-based character friendships motivated by collaboration more than competition. Cognitively, they're beginning to care about participatory knowing and creation more than just representational and practical. So, for example, for me, this showed up in more of a valuing of the way I can embody learning instead of just learning about it. And this made me quite frustrated with some of my Cornell classes because, for example, I took a Buddhism class. I was hoping that we were going to become Buddhists, that we were going to become spiritually enlightened in this class. And no, we showed up. It was taught by a white old guy, a professor who did zero actual meditation in class. Now, to be fair to him, he did have a meditation invitation for outside class, but I was frustrated. Like, we're learning about Buddhism just through the history. We're not going to dive into the actual practices. I think we missed out on a lot because of that. And you see this in a lot of education is valuing too much of representational and practical knowing over participatory. Green sees truth as not just scientific, logical, and rational, but emotional as well. They're still not very meta-systemic or holistic compared to tier 2, but they could realize, for example, the pitfalls with science and that all perspectives have some value. But they still don't see that the belief that all perspectives have some value is itself a perspective. So they can't see the meta contradiction, right? They say all perspectives have value. We shouldn't prioritize any one over another. But at the same time, that itself is a perspective. They're beginning to think in a meta manner about some things. Like they're asking, what is thought? What are emotions? Why is the university structured the way that it is? Socially, their relationships are chosen intentionally rather than just by proximity. They're still prone to comparison to some degree, but more so with themselves now. And again, this can lead to transformational conflict in which friendships are lost. My first freshman friend group, I left because they were all orange and I was transitioning into green. And the caveat is this can, if done poorly, create green comfort bubbles in which green stops putting themselves out of their comfort zone with orange and with amber. And this actually makes them weak. You'll see this with liberals who can't articulate their opinions to conservatives because they haven't developed them. And that's really unfortunate because if you've looked at the map so far, what I say next will sound harsh, but it's true. Liberals in general are more conscious than conservatives. They're higher in the ego map that we've been going through. But the problem is that doesn't always hold true. You can find many really conscious conservatives that have very articulate opinions, very well thought out, and liberals that are very unconscious in comparison. And if you argue with them about something like immigration or gun rights or abortion, they just won't be able to make a strong case because they haven't put themselves in those places where they're out of their comfort zone. I tried really hard not to let this happen to me. I went to speech and debate. I joined Cornell Political Union and debated with conservatives in there, even though I'm very far on the left. So this can be a shadow of green, definitely. They're starting to peer into the emotional world of their friends. They listen more. They ask better questions. They start to give advice not just rooted in their own worldview, but they can actually put themselves in the worldview of another, which was still a struggle for Orange. So this is a revolutionary new ability with Green. And they value honesty, growth, and shared values a lot in friendships. Morally, they're world-centric. So that includes animals and evil people, whereas Orange was more so world-centric in a way that didn't include evil people. They, because of this, in comparison to Orange, they value rehabilitative justice more. They don't just want to punish people for doing something wrong, like punitive justice. They want them to get better. They don't like how animals are being mistreated inside industrial factories. And you might see Green become vegan or eat less animal products over time. The joke is that Green can become the classic anti-capitalist hippie, posting about the evils of consumerism from a MacBook Pro at a Starbucks. So there is a contradiction in Green's worldview is they can be very performing if they're not careful. They can act so conscious, and yet their actions are actually not that conscious compared to tier two. They have a growing sense of responsibilities toward others. For me, I definitely feel this, despite how sometimes I just want to run and hide in a cave for the rest of my life. It's very difficult for Green to validate something like that because they feel that responsibility to help others. And if they're not actualizing it, they feel bad to some degree. Aesthetically, they're more valuing of how art embodies individual and collective identity rather than just external competence. So for example, I began appreciating the Stormlight Archives more when I became Green, in spite of its awful jokes, in spite of its subpar prose, because the characters, the setting, and the themes are just... I'm not sponsored by the Stormlight Archives, by the way. But if you're watching this, Brandon Sanderson, I would definitely be sponsored by you, not gonna lie. I've read that series like 4 times over. And write in the comments if you have as well. That would be glorious. Their style becomes an expression of values rather than just competence, individuality, or rebellion. Of the internal landscape, and not just their internal landscape, but of society's whole internal landscape too. Now, before, rebellion could be an orange reaction against amber, trying to break free from the group. But now rebellion can sometimes show up as a reaction against orange. That's what happens with all the tier 1 stages, is they grow up and they're not yet tier 2 where they can see the value in all the stages. So they can become very reactionary against the stages below or above them. Spiritually, Green is drawn to contemplative practices, to philosophy or wisdom traditions for a mix of practical and psychological purposes. But they still approach it more practically. So, they might do meditation and martial arts for stress reduction, while at the same time, unlike Orange, feeling they channel something deeper in them whenever they do it. And they can't yet really recognize what that might be, but there's that feeling that something is there, and they just need to uncover it. They're still focused on building up the self rather than deconstructing it. You have to construct a healthy self before you can begin to deconstruct it. So this is good to some degree. They shouldn't be spiritually bypassing by trying to eradicate the self at this point. That is for tier 2. Now, some nuances about Green, now that we've dove into it. Again, I hope you see just how cool this map is. Like, recognize where you are in Green and where your friends are and where society is as a whole. When I first learned about this, I was like, some nuances are that you can be any type across any of the stages. So what types are specific individual ways that you relate to the world. Personality is a really good example. You can be any personality across any of the stages. You can be more of a bubbly, more of a serious person, more extroverted, more introverted. And so the reason this is important to realize is that in any of these stages, you can embody them more masculine or in a more feminine way, because that's also a type. So think, what does a feminine orange look like? Some of the things that I said about orange will be a little different if you embody them in a feminine way. You might be more caring and more empathetic, even as you're grounded in orange, if you embody it more feminine. The stages also, another really cool insight, is they switch between individual and collective focus. So Amber was very collective focused, right? The group was very important, the in-group specifically. Then we go to Orange and we go to more of an individual focus. How can I build my self-esteem? How can I build my competence? How can I be my own independent person? And then Green goes back into the collective. We feel more valuing of community, of relationships, sometimes too much. And we'll see the same oscillation happen with tier 2, where we go back to the individual to some degree. The last insight is that forcing a stage on someone is unwise. They have to realize it themselves. A good quote that embodies this is, "A person convinced against their will is of the same opinion still." I remember much of the struggle of learning the stages of ego development for me was unfairly projecting it onto my parents. When I learned it, I was like, look how cool this is. Why aren't you guys going into tier 2? As well as with some of my other friends. And it just wasn't the headspace that they were in at the time. And by trying to force it on them in a way that felt more like a need from me, I needed validation of this new thing that I was getting into, I was embodying tier 2 in more of a shadow way by not valuing letting them respect being in the stage they're at. So those are some nuances. And I want to just wrap up tier 1 and recognize what we just went through. The tier 1 stages, again, those were Cosmic Follower, amber, Cosmic Climber, orange, and Cosmic Weaver, green. They're all about authoring a self. First, it's you learn how to belong, then you learn how to succeed, and then you learn how to choose, right? College at this level is a proving ground for identity, building up your values, your skills, your relationships, your ambition, your meaning, building up your sense of self. But there's also a quiet tension that runs through all 3 stages, because even as you become more independent, as you become more intentional and self-aware, the self starts to feel quite heavy to carry. You have to put effort into continuing to survive the version of you that you are. You have to defend your values against the other stages. You have to continue your routines, your habits, the people that you're around in order to feel grounded. And that friction isn't failure. It's actually developmental. Tier 1 asks, who am I and how do I build a good life? But eventually another question starts to become really, really interesting. And that is, what is the self that I've been building? And why does it feel so fragile? That question is the question to doorway 2, which is tier 2. Tier 2 stage, the Cosmic Wizard, is the stage where you realize the value in all the stages. The stage is teal in color, and it is the stage where you truly, truly start to appreciate amber, orange, and green. All relativistic evaluations of a certain way of seeing the world because of the context that they're in. They have a more holistic fourth-person perspective than green does because they're able to understand and embody how worldviews come into being, are now, and will be in the future. And they deeply appreciate individual growth and systemic meta-thinking. And they're driven to work towards growing the entirety of the world up the stages of ego development. It's no longer just about building yourself up. It's about building everyone else up the map. They immerse the deepest in self-actualization out of any stage and are getting deeper and deeper into self-transcendence and spirituality. What holds them back the most, though, is the few shadows that they still carry from amber, orange, and especially green. And the lack of the skills that they need for fully actualizing their vision in the world is constantly frustrating. Perhaps more than any other stage, they struggle with the gap between who they could be and who they are. Cosmic wizards, teal thinkers, are rare. There is no society which has any significant portion right now. But you can find them on the outskirts of some places, particularly in education and spiritual centers, and also nonprofits and Conscious College. Sorry, what? They're also harder to find in business, but they do still exist. Just depends on the business that we're talking about. They have the thing that's so beautiful about this whole map is that we've seen every single time we've gotten to around 10% of the world population is at a certain stage, a whole new movement occurs. We saw it with amber when we moved from more hunting and gathering cultures into agrarian urban culture. We saw it with orange when we moved from the medieval period to more of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. And we saw it with green, with the civil rights movement and with the United Nations and post-World War II Reformation. So what I'm really excited for is when this same thing happens with teal. What is the world going to look like when 10% of the population is at teal? That is going to be monumentous. And I have confidence it's going to happen in our lifetime. So there is going to be a profound transformation that we get to witness, because this is not like the movements from orange to green or from amber to orange where you're still in tier 1. This is an entire tier shift. It could actually be the most transformative thing that has happened to humanity in our entire history. So I'm excited. And for me, I began moving from green to teal, and I'm still in the process, around my senior year of college, which was 2 years ago. This was a combination of many things, of people in my life that were embodying aspects of teal, having relationships that are all way older than me, a lot of them in their 50s, 60s, sometimes even 70s, and also going through a lot of hardship mainly from people not in tier 2, and having to reflect on why that is and learn to love it as well. Some potential examples of this in society, even though it's hard to find, is a professor who teaches content in a developmental context, explicitly names how different students are embodying different things. Faculty designing courses around transformation, not just coverage, integrating reflection, systems, thinking, ethics, and meaning, not just the information. More of that participatory knowing. Interdisciplinary researchers bridging science and ethics and humanities and spirituality together. And also a ridiculously conscious student. I don't think I met any real teal thinkers at Cornell, but I'm sure at least some students are teal. It's really hard to find. You tell me in the comments if you found anyone. Their self-other boundary of teal is they're capable of taking a holistic fourth-person perspective on first, second, and third persons, which allowed them to create, to teach, and reflect meta-systemically for themselves and for others. They're beginning to appreciate the profound degree that the self impacts one's meaning of college, and also reality as a whole. And they work tirelessly to understand their own self because of it. This is the first stage that's really able to see the culture wars and step outside of it. Now that you have the map, you can see what are the culture wars that are happening in society. Well, there's the 3 groups that are fighting in most of society are between amber, between orange, and between green. And once you get to tier 2, they're just, you recognize the futility of the fighting. We're all on the same team here. And you stop affiliating and madly defending your group. They're able to see the postmodern contradiction that there can be value in all perspectives, like Green says, and yet some perspectives are just better than others in certain contexts for certain goals. They recognize that the value in all perspectives is itself a perspective, and not always the right one. On the light side, they have a deep appreciation for the need of all ego development stages without collapsing into relativism. They're deeply shadow aware, and they take responsibility for their whole life. Whatever happens to them and whatever they do, they take 100% responsibility for. They're able to talk to other stages of ego development with grace so that they can actually move up. So an example, this is also why they're called cosmic wizards, is because this is called spiral wizardry. They're able to move down the spiral of ego development depending upon the situation and actually help other people grow into the higher stage. I really resonate with this from my own relationship with my brother, even though I recognize that his orange stage, which he's at right now, is necessary for the context he's in. Right now, he's living more with my parents. He's wanting to make money so he can be more financially free. And this genuinely will, I think, make him happier and also get him higher up the stages. Now, I don't think all the suffering that he feels is necessary in order to do it, but the stage he's in makes sense for the context he's in. And sometimes I wonder if I went up the stages too fast for the context I'm in, because there are still some deficiency needs. Well, really, it's only finances, if I'm being honest, that I need to fulfill in order to feel fully able to ground in teal. On the shadow side, teal can be a lone wolf isolationist. And this is because green is more communal. They're more okay with being in a group and being emotionally connected. Teal resonates with that, right? They had to transcend and integrate green, but they also recognize how that itself makes them really biased, because green still can't see how fully they're being biased by being around other green people. Makes them sound like aliens. Teal sees that and they react a little against it, and they actually split off a little more from the group, because since most of society isn't teal, it biases their thinking a lot. And I definitely feel that. Since I became teal, I'm still very extroverted, but I'm much less communal than I was a few years ago. Because whenever I get in a group context, I can just feel it lowering me in spiral development. And for what I need right now, I can't do that. I remember in particular, there was one particular experience which made me change from this to be more isolationist, and that was when I was in speech and debate. It was so chokingly green at Cornell. It was just so full of trigger warnings and politically correct pacifists. And these are all good to some degree, but it was so over the top. Like, I remember there was one tournament where a person on one of the other schools didn't like my teammate's speech because they didn't give a trigger warning at the beginning. And so instead of talking it out with them afterward, they went to the tournament directors and reported them. And I was like disgusted at this degree of passivity. Like, they had the gall to do something about it, but they couldn't talk to the person's face. And that is a shadow side of green. So I did not like that. And when I moved to teal, I was more separated from groups that were too far into that LGBTQ pacifism. I'm still a part of the LGBT community. It's just I don't want to be immersed in groups that are too deep into it. And I say that as someone who's very far on the left. So I'm just trying to recognize the value in all the perspectives. Teal can also be over-reliant on their meta models for explaining reality. So an example is me getting caught up in spiral knowing, or the truth compass, or the meta hexagon. These are all meta models which I've made because the meta modeling feels safer than actually going into the weeds and immersing self in culture. Now, teal doesn't completely ignore that, of course. They're too conscious for it. But unlike the final stage, they do still get caught up in this meta modeling instead of the directness, the penetrating directness that is required to change reality. They have a struggle with the duality between doing and being. And an example is it's paradoxical for teal because they feel whole as they are, but also they still want to have a profound effect on the world. And so they feel like they can just be without needing to do anything, but then they also want to do in order to make the world a better place. So this tension is very alive at this stage. Some of the questions they're asking is, what about me must still grow to actualize my vision? They take radical responsibility. 100% of what happens to them, they have to work because they realize that their own self is the greatest bottleneck to what they want. Another question that they ask is, how can I integrate all perspectives into a more powerful, holistic whole? How can I find and build deep relationships of character while still actualizing my vision? Green is capable of forming friendships across the whole spiral with more ease than or teal is more capable of doing it with more ease than green. They can have friends in amber, they can have friends in orange, they can have friends in green. And it works because they recognize all of the differences and they appreciate them. Whereas this would still be hard for green. In terms of needs development, they have deepening growth needs to be more self-deconstructive and spiritually oriented. So it's not just about exploration, love, and purpose anymore. It's really about transcending the ego and the needs themselves. They don't need anyone to fulfill them. They're whole as they are, and yet they still seek out others and fulfilling those needs externally with that internal rooting. In terms of physical development, they see the body as deeply integrated with reality. There's a great book on this called The Body Keeps the Score. And the idea is essentially our emotions, our thoughts, our trauma literally embeds itself in our body and carries throughout our life. So partly from appreciation of this, they seek the embodiment of ideas and not just conceptual understanding of them. They have a deepening integration of their learnings. Emotionally, their inner processes are multifaceted, complex, and neither good or bad. They realize we're made of many parts, and all of them have different beliefs about what's good and bad for us. And the secret is in integrating these parts together to work on a team rather than having them fight each other. Emotions are welcomed as mirrors to what needs to be learned, and they can draw wisdom from almost any experience, including dreams, imagination, non-ordinary consciousness states. And this will baffle Orange particularly because you'll tell them things like, I just went on a 12-hour walk, and they'll be like, what? Why? It doesn't make sense to some of the lower stages. Motivationally, their motivation is increasingly quiet, stable, and intrinsic. So it's mostly white hat, right brain. There is a lot of epic meaning and calling toward collective awakening and well-being of humanity. A lot of development and accomplishment, but their growth is framed as service, not just self-improvement. A lot of empowerment of creativity and feedback to build systems, to build curricula, to build models and communities or art that awakens people. And also a lot of social influence and relatedness. They value deep alliances and co-creation. And most importantly, they value win-win-win. Most of society is still in win-win. And that means I win, and also the person I'm working with wins, but we don't really pay attention to if the context that we're working in wins. So teal really thinks about, how can I do something that wins for everyone? Cognitively, there's a deep immersion in arcs 1 through 8 of spiral knowing. So they value reflection a lot, which is spiral arc 8. And they can reflect on how their own childhood impacts their evaluation or teaching of psychology, for example. So they can move around spiral knowing arcs and see how each of the arcs is impacted by their worldview. They have a deeper appreciation of sociocultural and also epistemological relativism, and also a beginning appreciation of ontological. So If you don't know what those mean, sociocultural is just how our culture and our values are relative depending upon the context. And epistemological is how our very truth and knowledge is relative. And then ontological relativism is how our very being, like our root just consciousness of the world, is relative. So this is the point where, you might stare at a wall for 20 minutes and then your friend becomes deeply concerned when you text them, does this wall exist? They're embodying all parts of the metahexagon. So they're genuinely creating novel frames for things that are outside of the frames already in reality, like spiral knowing, general relativity. Got to toot my own horn there a little. Sorry. Socially, they try very hard to keep their act together among people because they want to come across as reasonable, as wise, and as mature so that others will develop. And they can sometimes, because of this, have a bit of an inflated sense of self-growth and wisdom. I've definitely experienced that to some degree. I think it's gotten better over time, but I do still feel it. They can coach and mentor with extreme precision to the individual's development. They'll get people, I've had this happen to me, people will say, how the hell did you know that about me? And I always say, patterns, my friend. Aesthetically, they're beginning to move towards finding beauty in the whole world, even the bad things. So you can check out my absolute love video above if you want to hear more about that. They appreciate the beauty of lower stages even if they don't resonate with it. And they find beauty in places you wouldn't think of as finding beauty, like systems that work. They can be beautiful. Systems that grow people up the stages are beautiful. Morally, they're beginning to move towards cosmic compassion. So they feel love for almost everything in reality. Bad people, animals, even aliens on other planets. But that's still not fully actualized, like in the last stage. They genuinely feel principled anger and righteous indignation towards the injustices of the world while trying to minimize judgment or blame for them. This is the paradoxical nature of judgment because they have to simultaneously realize that their judgments are completely relative while also believing that some things will make the world a better place than others. So they hold even harmful individuals with a developmental frame. And then finally, spirituality is becoming more lived and not sought. You don't have to do yoga or go to some retreat. You can practice spirituality while having a difficult conversation or working on your schoolwork. Anything, really. Spirituality is expressed through living, through presence, and through service. There's less interest in just peak experiences and more in integrating them into everyday life. So that's Teal. Again, I don't think most college students, almost any that I know, are really here. But this can be, if you're green, a big goalpost for you, and would drastically better college if most students were here. So to wrap up, the tier 1 stages were all about building the self, mapping how we author ourselves consciously, and then tier 2, how we begin to deconstruct ourselves, the rules that we subconsciously integrated, the ladder that we climbed, the meaning that we attributed. And now tier 3 is where you stop even trying to deconstruct the self or win the metasystemic game, and you start asking what winning even means and why there's a game at all. Instead of just thinking metasystemically about the self, both individually and collectively, emphasis is put on transcending the self entirely by directly witnessing how it creates reality and then transcending even that dualistic interpretation. So this last stage is a little bit more of a meme because there is absolutely no way any college student is here. I'm definitely not. And this is sort of like the ultimate goalpost to get to because there's almost nobody in society here. In fact, I can't even think of someone I know personally that is here. But it exists. It definitely does. I know of people who are in this stage. So let's explore stage 5. Stage 5, the cosmic luminary, color being indigo, which happens to be my favorite color as well. So pretty sick. The cosmic luminary is dissolving all perspectives to realize its oneness with all of reality, with spirit, the groundless ground of experience. There is no longer a felt separation between self and world, inner and outer, sacred and ordinary. In college or anywhere, life is met exactly as it is, with effortless compassion, clarity, and love. Nothing needs to be improved, yet everything is deeply cared for. Everything flows into absolute truth, absolute love, and absolute infinity. Barely anyone exists that has reached this stage. Anytime that they come into society, it's a pretty big deal. Jesus, the Buddha, the Dalai Lama, I've still not reached it. I'm grounding in teal 100%. But some potential examples, which you might not have heard of, are also yogis, enlightened Buddhist monks, professors deep into spirituality on the fringes of academia as well. This self dissolves all perspectives and the self-other boundary. So there is no first, second, third, or fourth perspectives. They were all arbitrary dualities inside of a universe that is non-dual. On the light side, there is absolute truth. If you don't think absolute truth exists, then just listen to more Conscious College videos. I've not fully embodied it, unfortunately, but I think you'll get closer. Absolute love is also a light side. I have a video on that. And absolute infinity. To go more in depth about what those are in this video would take much too much time. So I'm going to leave it there. However, there is still shadows that can happen. Those being first the ungrounded terror, because getting to this stage requires transcending the self. That can be very ungrounding if you're not ready for it. They can also be impractical. And if you're not careful, going to the stage, worldly matters can start to feel pointless. You become so interested in spirituality that even though the everyday is also spiritual, it feels less meaningful. This stage can also become airy-fairy. They're so deep into spirituality that other stages, if they're not careful, can be like, what? Some questions they're asking are, how does reality wish to move through this moment? How can love respond here without effort or agenda? And what do relationships look like when nothing needs to be moved? In terms of needs development, there are no needs to be maintained. Physical development, the body is non-dual. There's actually this joke in spiritual circles, which is if you're at stage 5 indigo, you'll look up at the sky and it feels like it's falling on your face like a pancake, because there is no thing as distance. It's made up. Health, fatigue, pleasure, and pain are all met with equal intimacy. Walking through campus feels the same as doing meditation. Emotionally, emotions are non-dual. You aren't feeling, the universe is feeling through you. Emotions arise and dissolve as moments of the whole, and there's no clinging to any particular one, positive or negative. Motivationally, motivations are non-dual. Actions arise spontaneously from care. It makes it really hard to say in language because language is dualistic, and reality is non-dual. So indigo isn't trying to do anything. They're just doing what flows through them in the moment, which can look like trying on the outside, but to them, it doesn't feel that way. Cognitively, they have a deep appreciation and embodiment of all 9 arcs of spiral knowing. They understand everything is founded in arc 9. You are that, which is consciousness. You are the creator of all experience. Everything that you perceive is created. A chair, another person, your reactions to hearing what I'm saying at this moment, it's all created by you. And you with a capital Y as the universe, not with a lowercase y as the egoic self. You embody all aspects of the truth compass, the highest of perspectives, all four directions. And you're deeply appreciative of all of the meta hexagon. Every way you can go meta, you deeply embody. Socially, relationships are non-dual. Others are met exactly where they are, without agenda. And these people have a profound effect on others when they enter the room. You can see it in their eyes, in their presence. They enter the room and it's like the air is richer, has more oxygen. They're ripplers. They understand that every interaction has the potential to ripple out more good into the world. Morally, they have a complete concern for the entirety of the cosmos. No animal, no human, no rock, no distant alien, no atom is not to be concerned, is not to be cared for. Aesthetically, they have found beauty in literally everything. A fork, a syllabus typo, a bad group project. Me staring at the figurines of my Scythe board game while on a particularly strong, let's just say, mushroom. Nothing is excluded from the sacred, is a cosmic luminary. A dog shit is sacred. Spiritually, they're less interested in peak states and more in the ordinary moments. Awakening is no longer an event, it's the default state of reality. Remember when we talked about the difference between states and structures? These are the state, the highest state stage is embodied structurally at Indigo. Not in the earlier stages, but at Indigo, everything is embodied. Technically, that's slightly false to say, according to integral theory, because the stages go a little bit differently than how I laid out. But for our purposes in my mapping, Indigo embodies all of them. Some nuances, now that we understand Indigo, I know that might have been a bit out there for some of you, but this is the highest thing that we're reaching towards. I wanted to go a little bit more into how each stage sees the other stages, because I think that's very interesting. So I wanted to begin with Amber. How does Amber see Orange? Materialistic heathens who abandoned the tribe to worship their own resume. How do they say Green? Sentimental pacifist weaklings who don't respect authority and cry about everyone's feelings. Teal are strange intellectuals with their heads in the clouds, talking in circles about circles. And Indigo are spiritual heathens, because whatever god they found, it is not Amber's. How does Orange see the other stages? Amber are communal black and white fools, useful business partners, but terrible thinkers. Green are overly sentimental idealists who feel their way to a solution that needs a spreadsheet or some logic. Teal are interesting, intelligent, but albeit misguided intellectuals who overthink what could just be executed. And Indigo are strange spiritual practitioners. There is some skepticism on the surface, but also a quiet longing underneath from Orange. How does Green see the other stages? Amber are misfortunate, rigid people deserving of care and good understanding. Orange are unempathetic, cruel, selfish, capitalism in a Patagonia vest. Teal are intelligent change makers who lack empathy and love their frameworks more than people, but still should be respected. And Indigo are spiritual heroes, the ones who actually made it out of the whole rat race. How does Teal see the other stages? Amber is the foundation everyone forgets they're standing on. Order before growth, structure before freedom, held with care, watched warily for rigidity. Orange is the engine, admires the drive, quietly grieves how much it can't yet see. Green is a former self in a kindred spirit, loves it, but they also see right through its airy-fairy relativism and comfort bubble.
Indigo is what they're reaching towards. It's an aspiration shading into envy because they can't fully embody indigo with how they currently are. And then how indigo sees the other stages. Amber is no outgroup left to defend against. They're conformist and mystic turn out to be the same spirit that indigo has, but they're just wearing different costumes. Orange, they witness the climb without judgment. The striver is met mid-stride, and they're loved as fiercely as if they'd already arrived. Green, they see the longing for connection, but they recognize that it's already been fulfilled, and they just don't realize it. There was never anyone separate to connect to. And then finally, teal. They see it as a map maker still clutching their maps, met with tenderness, but knowing that once the grip loosens, they will be able to meet each other as comrades. So that's how all these stages see each other. And now, before wrapping up the series, I just wanted to give 3 simple steps to applying the conscious college journey, the mapping that I just gave you. Step 1 is to attune to yourself, right? Now, attunement is an analysis. It's not slicing yourself into a stage like a coroner. It just means you're witnessing the present with caring intent. So you're sitting with what's actually there, the tightness before a lecture, the care you have for a friend, and you just want to see it clearly so that you can move on to step 2, which is recognize your structure stage and the lines of development that you have. You want to not think of yourself as a single dot, like I am this stage, as a judgment, but more as a dimension. Where do you show a bit of amber or of orange or of green, or maybe even a little of teal? As you think about where you are on your lines, you can move on to step 3, which is progress in those lines towards the next stage. Now, growth doesn't just come from progressing up the lines towards the next stage, but also navigating the shadows that are keeping you in some of the stage below. So pick a line or 2 you want to work on from step 2 and choose a small practice that pulls it in. Not 12, not a whole new morning routine you'll abandon after a few days. And slowly you will get farther up the stages with an actual map instead of having to do it like most people have had to their whole life, which is staying at the stage they're most of their community is in, or accidentally going up. So I hope this series was profound. I just want to emphasize college does not end with graduation. Not really. What ends is the chapter where growth is compressed, accelerated, and painfully obvious. But the deeper thing that continues is what you've been doing without realizing it your whole life, which is unfolding, becoming, spiraling up the stages. So across this video, you've seen the self take shape, then soften, and then finally get transcended. And here's the quiet but beautiful truth that's underlying the whole thing, is there is no final stage where you arrive. There's only the deepening. The college student chasing grades becomes the graduate chasing purpose. The purpose seeker becomes the system creator, and the system creator becomes the witness. And the witness eventually discovers that there was no self separate making the journey in the first place. So the story never ends because it was never meant to. You grow, you forget, you grow again. You keep deepening over and over and over through the stages so that you can return each time more fully to yourself and more fully to others. Because the purpose of college was never to get a title, a job, or a major. It's learning how to live as a bridge for yourself and for others again and again and again. Spirit continually developing and forgetting just so that it can remember who it truly was. If you enjoyed, this video, you will love my free college freshman cosmic journaling kit. It is a gamified journaling system with over 1,000 journaling questions that you can grow your emotional intelligence, your self-understanding, and your purpose up the stages of ego development in just 15 minutes a day. Check it out in the description below. As always, I hope you have a splentastic, phenomenal rest of your day. Eat some peanut butter, and goodbye.